Bismillah wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi ashabihi ajma'in. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I will start off with actually a story. Imagine one day Umar ibn Khattab radhiyallahu anhu enter upon Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radhiyallahu anhu, right? And then he saw him holding Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, holding to his own tongue. And Umar asked, what are you doing, Abu Bakr? What are you doing? Why are you doing this? Right? And that's when Abu Bakr said, this tongue of mine has bring me to dangerous places. Right? Why did I start off with this narration of Abu Bakr? That's actually collected in Imam Malik's Muwatta. Right? Why do I start off? Is because essentially whenever we give advice, it can be seen as like a weapon. A weapon, just like any weapon, it can be used for its benefit, that can bring revolutionary change, or it can be devastating to the person you're advising and to the person or to you as a person who is advising, right? So I want you to see it this way. Like nasihah is actually a very powerful weapon that can be used to your benefit or against your benefit, right? And then so there's a sister called Samina who is in her 20s. I'll narrate what she mentioned in a survey that's collected in Yaqeen Institute, right? And she said in a survey, I stopped coming to the masjid because I got sick of being treated like a second-class citizen. I already feel like that outside. I've actually felt better about my Islam when I don't hang out with too many Muslims. It allows me to tell myself that they don't represent Islam. Otherwise, when I come to the masjid and see how girls are treated, I start believing that we are really as backward as they tell we are. Right? This is actually a survey. A survey or a study Sheikh Omar Suleiman has done with his team in US, where they basically launched a series of surveying young adults Muslim about their fate, right? Turns out instead of us focusing too much on the Islamophobia outside of the Muslim community, in fact it's actually the Muslim community themselves are pushing people away from Islam. Right, so that's actually very, very detrimental, not to the youths alone, but to those who have recently embraced faith. Right, so it's very, very serious of an unnoticed cause that should be taken care for. Right, and Subhanallah, I remember last week Sunday was the Khalun Masjid Open Day. And then so I spent actually, whenever I receive questions from non-Muslim, majority of the questions are actually on answering the misbehavior of Muslims instead of Islam in itself. Why I'm saying so? Basically because Islam or Muslims themselves have leave such a negative image to non-Muslims, or at least it's portrayed that way in the media. So much so that non-Muslims, whenever they have questions about Islam, are actually questions on the Muslims, right? So I remember receiving a lot of questions from non-Muslim about our practice or our behavior as Muslims, more so as what is indoctrinated by Islam, right? And why is it harmful to the one who's advising? And subhanAllah, this is one of the most scariest hadith that any believer can ever come across, right? It shows the gravity of one's manners or one manners on speaking, right? And it's actually collected in Al-Adab Al-Mufrad. It's actually a narration, a series that's collected by Imam Bukhari, right? Where it focused specifically on narrations that talks about manners, right? And so Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu narrated that a man came to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and asked of a woman who prays a lot, who prays not only the 5 obligatory prayers, who prays even the night prayer, who gives a lot of charity, who does a lot of good deed, right? But she harms her neighbor with her tongue. Not with physical assault. We're talking about just words of insult to her neighbor, right? And so that man came to ask Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, what's her position in the sight of Allah, right? And guess what did Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam replied? Not only is the woman in hellfire, Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam mentioned she's deprived from all good. She's deprived from all good. And a different perspective, the man continued, said, how about of a woman who prays only her obligatory prayers and gives a bit of food in charity, yet she does not harm anyone? And Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam mentioned, she is amongst the people of paradise. Right? So imagine the words that's spoken out from your mouth will actually goes against you and actually go against the people whom you're advising. Right? So it's a very, very serious warning that we as Muslims should take hold. I remember why I decided to start talking about this topic is because all those quarrels or all those arguments sometimes we Muslims engage in are more often than not too necessary. More often than not too necessary. But yet we would see that as the most prime important in winning the argument, right? And back to the definition of nasihah. Nasihah actually comes from it's an Arabic word that comes from sincerity. It has the root word of sincerity. And if it comes from sincerity, so it comes with also the meaning of purity, right? It's so pure that the classical Arabs would basically use this to describe how honey, when honey are removed from their wax, that kind of purity, like pure silky honey that flows out, that kind of extraction process, that's actually used to describe honey being extracted, right? Nasihah, the word nasihah. So it actually means sincerity. And so it means advising your friend, or the one you're advising, at least, with absolute sincerity, right? That's the meaning of nasihah. And then, in a very famous narration, Prophet Muhammad mentioned, ad-deenu nasiha, ad-deenu nasiha, ad-deenu nasiha, right? Where it actually means the religion is advice. The religion is advice. The religion is advice. He repeated, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, repeated it 3 times. He repeated it 3 times, right? And then he continues that the companion basically asked, to whom, Rasulullah, right? Who should this sincerity or this nasihah be towards, right? And Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that's when he mentioned, to Allah, His book. It's not working.
No, use both.
Use both. Doesn't it look weird though?
Just do it. Brother Abil.
He said. So which one is going live now?
It's good.
Okay. And then so what does it mean? So Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam mentioned that to Allah, to His book, to His messenger, and to the leaders of the Muslims, and to the general people, right? So that's the nasihah Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam mentioned that the entire Islam can be represented in, right? I will just focus on the nasihah to the general people because that's essentially what I've been seeing that's in great lack in the community, subhanAllah. And so it's in itself a reminder for myself too, right? Because we can never attain the level of manners that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asked of us, right? So this is a reminder for myself too. So now the question is, if giving nasihah is something that's very important in Islam, but yet it can come with great risk, the next question that might comes into our mind is basically, how should it be given, right? How should advice be given? Or what's the proper etiquette or protocol in giving advices, right? And before I go into some of the examples in the life of Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam on giving advices, I want to start off with how Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam should be an example for us to follow, right? And in Surah Al-Qalam, Allah Subhanahu wa Taala mentioned that Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam is wa innaka ala kulikal adhim, right? Most definitely you, O Muhammad, this is Allah's word, who's acknowledging Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. Most definitely, O you Muhammad, is upon excellent of character. Ala means above. So kulukal adin means with great character, but when it's ala, above great character, that means it's above and beyond any good or any definition of good character. Any definition of good character. And subhanAllah, I remember there's a sheikh who was once asked the meaning of good character. So, and one of his students basically replied, to do good when somebody have done good to you, right? And then the sheikh replied, that's not good character, because that's something that even animals can do, right? When you treat an animal good, when you feed a cat, when you feed a dog, though it's not, it's a taboo in the community, but if you feed an animal, if you treat an animal good, that animal will automatically, by nature, treat you good, right? So as human beings, we're not asking for that level of good character, or at least that's not what Allah expects of us, right? The good character is basically when even though somebody is doing not too good to you, but yet you portray a character that's beyond what is expected of you, right? That's beyond what is expected of you. That's the definition of good character, right? And then, so now comes to the method of giving nasihah. I'll start with the most important one. And yet it's the most neglected one. And that is the concept of empathy. The concept of empathy. Right, I'll be describing this big English word later, but I'll start off with an ayah where it's again Allah Subhanahu wa Taala talking about Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, on what level or what degree he portrayed in terms of this excellent quality of empathy, right? Where Allah mentioned in near the last ayah of Surah Tawbah, verse 128, لَقَدْ جَاءَكُمْ رَسُولٌ مِّنْ أَنفُسِكُمْ, like we have sent down Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam amongst you. What does that mean? It means Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, just like many other prophets, were sent amongst the people, right? He's someone who's grown up in the community, which means he knows whatever you guys are going through. He has been grown up with that level of experience where he's gone through difficulties like any other human beings would have, right? SubhanAllah. So that's why scholars mention he's gone through some of the greatest or the most difficult trials in life. He buried most of his son and daughter, except for one only. He buried most of his daughters, except Fatima. And he's grown up as an orphan. And he's gone through a lot of rejection from the people who used to call him as-Siddiq al-Amin, right? The most trustworthy and the honest, right? and he have gone through rejection, he've gone through loss of relatives, some of the most difficult times of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? And then so he's gone through the difficulties that every single one of us will or may Allah protect us, may come across. May come across. Right? And the ayah doesn't end there. Azizu alayhi ma anittum. Right? Aziz means something very heavy. Very heavy in terms of weight. What does that mean? That the grievances or the pain that you go through is exactly what he has gone through too. Or is it what, or exactly what he himself has gone through, right? Hazizun alayhi, like haris actually means someone who's emotionally vested or emotionally invested into who? Alaykum, into you. Who's emotionally invested into your well-being, into your suffering, and into your difficulties, right? And then the ayah doesn't end there still. Bil mu'minina rahufur rahim, right? And he's especially, subhanallah, especially merciful to the believers. Like your grievances, your pain, that matters to him the most, yet, and especially for the grievances and the pain that the Muslims go through, right? And so that's why in Surah Kahf, which we are recommended to recite every Friday, la'alakum, like what difficulties or what troubles him to the extent where he would nearly kill himself is basically the disbeliefs of people, right? It's the disbeliefs of people. And subhanallah, there's this hadith where there was once a companion who was crying for a loss of a relative, for a loss of a father, basically, right? And he was crying not because of merely losing a father, but because his father died upon disbelief. His father died upon disbelief, right? And if you ask any reverts or Muslims who have non-Muslim family member, if there was one thing that they would ever want in this dunya, if there was one thing that they would ever want in this dunya, and that would be the guidance of their family members. I know of brother, whenever he know of people traveling or going for Umrah or going for Hajj, he would ask their brother to make dua for his mother. He will ask Allah, he will ask that person to make dua for his mother, for his mother's guidance. Right? So for believers, that's what really matters to them. Because the furthest of distance is not really the distance of this of the next continent, or the continent that's separated across oceans, right? But it's actually the distance in the hereafter, where being separated as a family, that's something that's most difficult for any reverts to even think about, right? And what did Rasulullah Sallallahu mention? Rasulullah Sallallahu comforted that Sahaba, that you, your father, and my uncle are both in hellfire. He didn't sugarcoat this the gravity of it to make the companion feel better, but yet he mentioned to him that I have gone through a pain similar to that too. And especially when Rasulullah Sallallahu is sent for the mercy of the mankind, how more merciful would he be to his uncle? How much more grievances would he have come across for his uncle's guidance, for the lack of his uncle's guidance, right? And so all these put into perspective of how Rasulullah Sallallahu was empathetic instead of sympathetic. Oh, this is now where I believe I need to define the term, where psychologist Theresa Wiseman defined empathy and sympathy. So anyone of you willing to give a try to define those two words? What's the difference between sympathy and empathy? Give it a try. Give it a try.
Empathy is being able to put yourself in the person's shoes.
How about sympathy?
Empathy is stronger
Mm.
than sympathy. Sympathy is, to me, is a noun.
Mm.
Empathy is a verb, so it's an action.
Mm.
I think the same meaning, but one is action, one is noun. It's just a name.
Actually, Brother well answered the concept of empathy. I'll just maybe explain the concept of sympathy, right? Through an example. Sympathy is basically, can be seen as looking into a hole, looking into a dark hole, and said, it's very dark there. It's indeed very dark there. And empathy would be stepping into the hole and feel the same darkness that you are feeling. Like so, Theresa Wiseman actually beautifully summarized from the psychological perspective on the concept of empathy, where she mentioned it's about taking perspective. Taking the perspective of the one who's going through the suffering. So basically absorbing it, right? The perspective of others, the suffering or the difficulties of others that's going through that problem, right? You're taking it in, right? And imagine how vulnerable a person can be in that position, right? When you need to empathize somebody, right? So basically you're taking in that perspective, right? And then the next part is staying out of judgment. When you empathize somebody, you will stop judging people. You will stop judging people. Right? Not only do you stepped in to that same hole, same dark hole, right? You won't judge people for having stepped into that same dark hole. Right? And continue with recognizing emotion out of people and communicating it back to people. Right, so it's defined by 4 characteristics, so to say. Right, you first start off with taking in the perspective, not judging others for it, recognizing the emotions that comes with it, and communicating it back out. That's the definition of empathy. Or in short, basically, just stepping into the safe shoes, walking the walk, right? And so Rasulullah perfectly embodied that, right? And at the end of the day, when you think about it, we as human beings, all of us have so similar experience, because there's no better lessons in life than mistakes. Mistakes, or it could be problems that we come across, right? So all these are actually lessons that make up us a human being, right? So another example that perfectly showcase the empathetic character that Rasulullah SAW embodied, right? And I'm sure many of you have heard of this narration, right? But yet less people focus on the empathetic response Rasulullah SAW has, right? So one day, imagine a Bedouin came into a mosque and decide to start peeing in one of the corner in the mosque. Right, I'm sure every one of us may have heard of this narration, right? I want you to imagine that is the sacred mosque, right? That is the sacred mosque. Somebody coming in and peeing in one of the corner, and if it were to happen in Kowloon Masjid, that guy is gone. That dude is gone. Right? He's been wiped out from the surface of the earth. Right? That dude is gone. Right? Imagine, this is the Prophet's mosque. Right? Somebody decide to start peeing in one of the corner. And the companions, of course, enraged. Right? Why would you do this? Right? And they were about to run to stop him, right? And what did Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam mention? Let him finish. Let him finish. Right? And the companions, of course, upon hearing this, we hear and we obey, right? And so they stopped and let him finish. And when that Bedouin finished, he was about to leave the mosque, right? And Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam called him out, not in public, of course, but called him aside and started telling him that the mosque, it's a place for Quran, it's a place for prayer, it's a place of great sacredness, basically, right? This is not something you are supposed to be doing, right? And so the Bedouin, he understood it, right? Why is this example important? It's because Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam know where he came from, because he was a simple Bedouin. So that's why the narration specifically mentioned the background of that companion, right? He's actually a simple Bedouin who knew not better, who doesn't know better. He doesn't know a mosque is supposed to be somewhere that is treated sacred to the extent where any waste, like to put it lightly, waste should not be dumped there, right? And so Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam understood where this Bedouin is coming from, right? So instead of calling him out, jumping on him, he decided to take a more understandable approach. Because at the end of the day, we are all ignorant except what Allah has guided us on. Right? We all are ignorant. SubhanAllah. It's a blessing of Allah that He granted us knowledge, or some level of knowledge that's more than others. And so in some way of shape and form, we've gone through that level of ignorance. Right? And Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam know that too. Right? In Surah Ad-Duha, where Allah mentioned, وَوَجَدَكَ ضَالًّا فَهَدَى, right? And we guided you, right? And so if Allah didn't guide it, Rasulullah, he wouldn't know how to worship Allah, right? He wouldn't know what's the perfect way of worshiping Allah, right? And so the Prophet Muhammad embodied that level of empathy, where he decided to advise the companion on the side. And subhanAllah, how did the Bedouin respond? Not only did he understood, in a narration collected in Sahih Muslim, where that person actually mentioned, that Bedouin replied, "May Allah have mercy on me and you, O Muhammad, and nobody else." Right? He told Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, may Allah have mercy only on me and you and nobody else. Because the companions wanted to jump on him, right? Wanted to take him down, right? And so Prophet Muhammad, he's the only one who exemplified the perfection of character, right? And then not only that, and so that's when Prophet Muhammad replied, "You have made something vast, you have constricted something that is vast." Basically, the thing that's vast is basically Allah's mercy, right? And so he again further advised him polite, beautifully, right? And so that's when Prophet Muhammad, the Bedouin, in another narration collected in Muslim Ahmad, where the Bedouin himself mentioned, "May my mother and my father be ransom for you." Right? Because the Prophet Muhammad didn't even scold him nor scoffed at him. Right? So how that person was able to absorb that advice Rasulullah gave him is because of how Rasulullah gave that advice. Right? And so we as believers should always give our fellow believers the benefit of the doubt. Right? How sure are we? How sure are we that Muslim brother whom we have seen a mistake on have been on the deen? He might be a new revert who's new to the deen. Or even so, he might be born a Muslim but never took his Islam to the level he did that day, or that day you're seeing him. Right? Every one of us need to start somewhere. But if you jump into a conclusion that he must know the thing you know, that in itself is a problematic perspective to have. Right? And so a scholar like Abu Kilaba, rahimahullah, mentioned a beautiful, beautiful saying on finding excuse for your fellow believers. If some information reaches you about your brother which you dislike, then search for him an excuse. Right? And if you don't find an excuse for him, then say maybe knowledge of his excuse hasn't reached me yet. Maybe so that narrator, that this scholar, Abu Kilaba, basically associate the lack of excuse for his fellow believer because of his lack of knowledge, not to the person whom he's seen doing acts which he dislikes. Right? And another protocol, I would say, when it comes to advising people, is actually to keep it private. And yet, subhanAllah, this is something I've seen, WhatsApp group. SubhanAllah, I don't know about the sisters group, but I can definitely testify to the brothers, MZHK brothers group, right? Vulgar, harassing comments pass on to each other in public platform where there are over 200 other Muslims. Where there are 200 other Muslims there. Right? And so if you were to make a statement of correction in public, be aware, just as you're exposing your brother's mistake, or the mistake that you find in him, which may not be true, right? Allah will expose yours on the day of judgment. Allah will expose yours on the day of judgment. In an authentic narration in Surah Tirmidhi, for whoever pursues the shortcoming of people, basically in public, Allah will pursue theirs. Whoever pursue the shortcomings of people, Allah will pursue theirs. Right? So it shows that if we were to expose the sins or the mistakes of our fellow believers in public, one day or another, Allah will expose ours. So that's why whenever you want to correct anybody in the Sharia, it's basically a standard protocol. Even when it comes to advising rulers. No matter how much a ruler, of course, a ruler is definitely on public display. Even when it comes to advising rulers, the standard protocol classical scholars would take is to advise them in private. And a third perspective, or a third approach, before you even start advising, make sure there's a relationship between them, between you and the one you're advising. Because at the end of the day, an advice or a nasihah should show genuine concern for one another, right? And if you don't even have that relationship, how likely are you able to present that concern genuinely to others, right? And so very important is to first build a relationship with that person before you can advise. And so Ibn Rajab rahimahullah, he basically listed out a few criteria or considerations when it comes to advising, when it comes to giving advice, right? And one of the criteria he said needs to satisfy or needs to be placed in consideration is basically your relationship with that person you're advising, right? And so this is something that we should pay attention whenever we want to advise. Make sure there's adequate relationship between you guys. What if there's not? Build it, right? Because if he is your fellow believer, how difficult will it be to build that relationship, right? Of course, upon halal leisure activities, inshallah, right? And the third point that I want to mention is about, in terms of the standard protocol on advising, on giving advice, is being kind and gentle. In an authentic narration, Prophet Muhammad mentioned, kindness is not to be found in anything. Kindness is not to be found in anything, but that it adds to it beauty. Right? Kindness is not found in anything except it will beautify it. Right? And it's not taken away or withdrawn from anything except that it would make it defective. So the lack of kindness in whatever you put in or whatever you've taken away will either beautify it or make it defective, right? And so some of the most beautiful example that I can recall is basically the hadith where Prophet Muhammad advised Salim's father. So basically, this is a companion whom in the lifetime of Rasulullah saw a dream. He saw a dream where he wanted to narrate to Prophet Muhammad directly, but out of the companion's haya or the shyness that the companions have. So basically, this companion, instead of approaching Prophet Muhammad directly, he told the dream to basically Hafsa, one of the wife of Rasulullah, right? He told the dream to Hafsa, right? And what is that dream? So he said, I had a wish of seeing a dream, and then he wanted to narrate, and so he saw himself, two angels caught him by both sides of his hand, and they were about to took him to the fire. Two angels were about to hold him by both sides. Were about to take him to the fire, which was built all around like a built well. A fire that's like a built well, right? And had two poles on it, and the people in it were known to me. So he saw people he recognized. He saw people in that well of hellfire, people he recognized, right? And when he was about to be thrown inside, right, he started saying, I seek refuge with Allah from the fire. And that's when he was told by another angel who told him to not be afraid. And he was then taken away from the fire. Right? He wanted to narrate this dream to Rasulullah, but then he'd done it through Hafsa. And upon hearing this, so many companions, so actually one of the habit of Rasulullah in the Fajr Salah, where he would actually ask companions, who amongst you have witnessed some interesting dreams? Who amongst the companions have witnessed interesting dreams? Where he can basically help narrate. Of course, only good dreams are supposed to be narrated, right? And for him to be actually freed from hell, from the fire in itself is a good sign, right? So he wanted the interpretation of this dream, right? And what did Rasulullah mention? He said, Abdullah is a good man. Abdullah is a good man. He didn't stop here. He said, if only he has prayed tahajjud, if only he has prayed tahajjud, or he basically wished him to pray tahajjud, right? He would have been a better man, basically. Right? And how did he started that advice off? Imagine when it comes to, these are issues of hellfire, Of course, companions would definitely want a straightforward answer, like a straightforward answer as to what to be done in order to free himself from the hellfire. Right? But yet, Rasulullah started off with acknowledging the good of him. Started off with acknowledging the good of him. Right? Sometimes we, as human beings, get too indulged into the mistakes of others that we fail to notice the good that others have been doing. Right? But yet Rasulullah SAW first acknowledged the good of Salim's father, Abdullah, and yet gave him the advice of praying tahajjud. Right? And that's when his son, Abdullah, mentioned, that's when he see his father used to sleep but a little at night. So basically, ever since that advice from Rasulullah SAW, he never slept much. That's the power of a single advice. Of course, this comes also at the importance that the companions see of Rasulullah SAW. But this is not to belittle any of our advice in itself. Right? So every single advice you give to people can actually bring about revolutionary change, either for good or bad. Right? And so at the end of the day, how should one give advice? Depends on actually just one solution, or depends on just one perspective that you should have when it comes to giving that advice, which is the way you want to receive an advice is exactly the same way you want to deliver it. The way you want to receive that advice is exactly the same way you should be giving it. Because Rasulullah mentioned, none of you truly believes. None of you truly have faith until you love for others what you love for yourselves. Right? This boils back down to also nasihah. If an entire deen can be summarized with nasihah, with good advice, sincere advice, then how about practicing it in a way that we want to receive it? I'll be closing soon, but before that, there's another perspective that the one who's often giving advice may fail to notice or fail to register. That is, it's not a must for them to accept the advice. It's not a must to accept the advice. Of course, this comes with a few perspectives, but what I mean is that whenever you give this advice, of course, you would want your brother to take note of what you're advising them of. But the perspective you should have is that it's not a must. It's not, I don't know how to explain this point. It's not a must for them to accept this advice. I'm not even making it. So put it this way. So the perspective you should have when you give advice, it's upon them, upon their decision to choose whether to accept this advice or not.
Up to them.
Up to them.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, an advice can be taken or they can be rejected. Right? Because if it's not seen that way, it would be an oppression instead of an advice. Because at the end of the day, Islam, subhanAllah, Islam is a word that comes with multiple meanings, right? Peace, submission, and one of the words that it embodies or it entails is basically sincerity, right? And for one to accept Islam sincerely from their heart, which means there is no way anybody, any family members, any friends, any wives or husband can ever impose this belief on others. It has to be something from the heart, accepted sincerely from the heart, right? Because that's essentially what sincerity in itself entails, right? And so when we give an advice, if we need or if we have the perspective that that person whom we are advising has to, or else is doomed, that kind of perspective, when we give that advice, it's actually an oppression. You're oppressing his right to choose. And so Ibn Hazm, rahimahullah, actually commented on this, and he beautifully stated that if one gives nasihah thinking that person absolutely has to accept it, they are no longer advising, they're oppressing that person. Right? So this is another perspective that I have, subhanAllah, I myself used to lack to until I studied this topic further. Right? So this is a practice, or this is a perspective for whom we are trying to advise towards, we should have first. We should have first. Right? And I'll conclude with this. In terms of receiving advice, just now I told you, it can bring about revolutionary change, right? And so Ibn Qudama, so because in one way or other, our lives can be made up of, or our general communication can be made up of, either being advice or advising others. Right? Ibn Qudama rahimahullah actually beautifully summarized this in an analogy. Advising others is like seeing a scorpion on your back. You know how desert used to have poisonous, toxic scorpions. The last thing you would ever want is to sleep with them on the same bed. Right? So you wanted to be advised of. Right? You wanted to be advised of. You wanted to receive an advice that there's a scorpion actually on your back that you need to get rid of. And this is the matter of this dunya. This is the matter of this dunya. How about for the matter of the hereafter? How about the matter of the hereafter? Where if we fail to notice, could bring about longevity of effect. Longitudinal, or if there's such a word, or eternal effect, basically. Right? And then so Ibn Qudama gave this example because at the end of the day, the one who's advising may not be right or may not be accurate, but it could be very important for our well-being. Right? It could be as a station of reflection where you can pause and think about where you are in life. So sometimes even for haters, take their advice. Though it might not be the most sincere of advice, but sometimes it may have shown up in some level when we interact with that person. Right? And then so Imam Shafi'i rahimahullah actually mentioned in a beautiful quote, he said, "I've never debated with someone except that I wish the truth becomes clear, regardless whether it comes from me or come from him." Right? Sometimes we end up in debates or in rejecting an advice because we think that person is speaking something that's untrue. But yet, Imam Shafi'i's perspective is that regardless of whether the truth is from, I just want it to be revealed. I'll end with a story of Imam Ahmad with a thief, with a person by the name of Abu Haytham. Right, I'll end with this story. Abu Haytham, I'm not sure have anyone of you heard of him? I've never heard of him until I heard the story. Right, but it's collected in many classical books, basically Islamic books, on who Abu Haytham is. Right. Imam Ahmad's son, Abdullah, used to hear Imam Ahmad make dua to this person, Abu Haytham. Right? He used to hear his father, Imam Ahmad, asking Allah to have mercy on Abu Haytham and pardon him his mistakes. Right? And who is Abu Haytham? Who's Abu Haytham? Right? And so the story goes by. I'll give you a little bit background before I jump into the story. Imam Ahmad rahimahullah is actually a scholar who frequently have to go against rulers. So he's a scholar who have been brought up in difficult times where rulers with incorrect beliefs will be imposing on scholars. Will be imposing on scholars to accept their incorrect beliefs. And we're talking about in Islamic history where there were Muslim kings, right? Leaders, right? But then because of their incorrect beliefs, they will impose this on other scholars. Many scholars gave in. But most certainly not Imam Ahmad, rahimahullah. Right? He didn't give in. And so Imam Ahmad himself mentioned that he's not scared of prison, nor is he feared, nor is he in great fear of prosecution. What is he scared of? He's scared of lashes. He feared lashes. Right? He said, I couldn't stand the fitna of lashes. He couldn't stand the fitna of lashes. And one day, when he was summoned by the king to give up on his belief, which he of course didn't, when his name was called, when he was about to receive his lashes, he got tugged by a person at his back. And that person asked Imam Ahmad, do you know who I am? And Imam Ahmad looks very confused. He doesn't know who that person is. And that's when that person mentioned, I'm Abu Haytham. I'm Abu Haytham, the notorious thief, who till that day recorded have received 18,000 lashes. He's the notorious thief who have received 18,000 lashes, who because he followed shaitan for the cause of this dunya. But you, Imam Ahmad, you are following Allah for the cause of Islam. So don't give in. That profound advice led Imam Ahmad, whom every single one of us demands or want his dua for, of course when he's alive. But yet Imam Ahmad remembers till the end of his life. That's the advice. Imam Ahmad, the great scholar, who didn't belittle that thief, that notorious thief, who gave him that advice. So I'll conclude here. So if there is any question, feel free to ask.
How do you know your advice is, you want to advise someone that you know your advice is correct, or is your opinion, right? Maybe other people take your opinion. You know what I mean? You want to accept your advice. How do you know? I think I'm correct, but people may think they're not accept what I say.
How do you, so basically I'll rephrase the question. So basically, I think it's two parts. So first, you want to know, how do you know whether your advice is correct or not? And the second part is
Second part is whether he accept or not, or she.
whether they accept or not. Okay, whether the person accept it or not. Right? To begin with, advice in itself does not have right or wrong. Or generally speaking, like from a general perspective, an advice is something that we want better for others. Right? Unless it's clearly defined, of course, in our creed, through our creed or not, but generally speaking, any advice, it's actually, there's no right or wrong to it. Say for example, if your advice, say for example, every time I come home, my mom would advise me to drink some soup before going to bed, right?
It's up to you, right? Yeah.
So at the end of it, there's no right or wrong
Yeah.
to that advice. Or you're given an advice to, for example, study harder. I don't know, I can't think of a more practical. But say for example, if you come across an advice that asks you to study harder, of course it's for your own good, but at the end of the day, it depends on that person to define whether that advice is right or wrong. So I wouldn't say it's completely on them, but you've done your part.
But if you giving people advice, may turn up like become we quarrel to each other. So I seldom to give my advice, you know. But it's happy if I see the person is okay, they won't be angry, then I will say about it.
So sometimes when it comes to, like the brother asks, so basically sometimes when you give an advice, it might end up in quarrel. At the end of the day, think about whether that advice really matter. Because sometimes it could be a political view where it doesn't change any circumstances. Where it could be a stance to take when it comes to whether something is of preference, something more on exposure, on what upbringing or what experience that person has gone through, and rather really it's advice to take, if you get what I mean. So in the first place, we should ask whether that's an advice. If we know it would end up in quarrel, we should ask ourselves whether it's an advice really would make a difference. Right? And then the next thing, and the next perspective I want to have, we've heard of the narration where there are 3 signs of hypocrites, but there is actually a fourth. There's actually in an authentic narration where there's a fourth sign of hypocrisy where many Muslims fail to notice. That is when you quarrel with somebody, you end up raising your voice, or you end up enraging yourself. That's actually a characteristic of hypocrisy that Rasulullah ﷺ defined. Something that's hated to Allah, basically. Right? So whenever we find an issue which we may not agree upon, then we accept the differences. We may not accept what they are differing on, but we accept there are differences. And subhanAllah, this will actually make life much more easier. And this will actually make relationship much more harmonial.
I think dua is the better way.
Yeah, of course. Of
rather
course.
Than talk to my own view. Okay, bring to Allah. That's it.
True.
You know what I mean?
True.
So I sometimes give my opinions. That's why I don't want to, especially political issue. So I don't try to get involved.
Yeah.
If something happy, I will say about it. It's my own opinion, right? So don't get it so pompous, so scared.
True.
Yeah. So I don't want to turn out like even it's not happy.
I'd like to add to the brother's question. What would be your advice to us youth? Because a lot of the times we're unsure whether we should be giving advice to the grown-ups, right? Because a lot of the times we're in a position where we think the grown-ups should know better, or they should be more aware of the situation, or whether we are in a good position to give advice. A lot of the times we're unsure whether it be political issues. Let's just put politics aside for a bit. You've mentioned the MCHK Brothers group, right? So, MCHK Brothers group, or just in the classroom, or just in gatherings, how would you advise the youth or the younger ones to go forward with advice, especially when dealing with grown-ups who we think should know better or should be more aware of the situation?
Like the brother basically asked, let me summarize it in short, and let me know if I got the question correct. So when it comes to youth advising their elderly, what is the correct approach to it, basically, right?
Say parents, sometimes it can be
parents,
elder cousins, just elders in general.
Wow, that's a tough question.
Muslim parents.
Whether
Muslims
Muslim
or
or
non-Muslims.
non-Muslim,
Yeah.
just elders.
So very hard.
So it can be teachers, parents. I'm not just singling out parents here. It could be
They will listen to
teachers.
I would say at the end of the day, there's actually a narration that I've come across in the past. I forgot which companion it was. If I'm not mistaken, it was, if it's not Ali radiallahu anhu, it would be Hassan radiallahu anhu, right? He once saw a man, a really grown-up man, making wudu incorrectly. He was making wudu incorrectly. And so he, as a young man, because sometimes we need to acknowledge that it's there, whether we like it or not. Elderly people generally don't like receiving advice from their younger peers. This doesn't make it a law of relationship, probably, right? But it's definitely there. At the same time, it's for the grown-ups to recognize our advice at the end of the day is for their own good, right? So how about for the youth's perspective? Let me continue with the story. And what did the companion did? He saw that grown-up, that elderly man making wudu incorrectly. SubhanAllah, his wisdom. He asked, so basically he asked that old man to see whether he's doing wudu correctly or not. To see whether he's doing wudu correctly or not. Instead of going like out full blown, like how could you be doing wudu like this? The order is incorrect. You're not washing the body parts clean enough or complete enough. Right? Instead of bashing on that old person, because he knows that old person has an honor or has certain level of dignity in him, whether we acknowledge that or not, right? And so what he go about is that he asked that old person to see whether he was doing wudu correctly or not. And through that process, he actually managed to educate that elderly man the correct way. So why is this story important? Is because there's no one perfect scenario on advising others. At the end of the day, it depends. It varies from person to person, and it varies from you as a person, or it varies from relationship to relationship. Right? So there's no perfect answer to it, but certainly, there are times which a person is most likely to accept advice. And maybe find out where those times are. So for example, for my mom, it would be when I'm out with her. When I'm out with her on the streets where we are alone and walking, that's the time where she's most likely to accept advice or to have those deep conversation together. I find that at least that's okay. Again, where relationship to relation and person to person. And that's basically how our relationship from me and my mom is based upon. Right? So there's no short answer to it, but at the end of the day, there are methods where you might have come across which works better with that person you're trying to advise. I'm sure I didn't answer your question, but at the same time, I want you to never stop seeking or searching for that prime method or that prime time.
Find a happy time.
Yeah, find a happy time or find
You can
moments where you can give that advice peacefully, at least. Right? And at the end of the day, whether they accept it is again a different story. But it's actually your obligation to find that right time and right method when it comes to giving advice. More question? Nobody's on your left. Any more question?
I mean, we are surrounded by the non-believer.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm glad I'm good. But I mean, sometimes you have to bear with the others. They are not living Muslim. So they may have doing something funny, but you don't get peace of them. Just try to forgive them somehow.
True.
You cannot put your expectations so high because they don't have they never accept Allah, so they don't know what's right.
So the brother basically mentioned about being more tolerant.
Yes, tolerant.
Tolerant to non-Muslims who are living around us. Because at the end of the day, we're still minorities, and many of them have no idea of the many prohibitions or rulings of Islam themselves. So I'd actually say Muslims generally, or at least Muslims here, who have been living in as minority for decades now, are more tolerant towards. But when it comes to Muslims making those mistakes, I kind of put it in words how intolerant the community can get. And this is something, again, a lesson for myself and for everyone here, that we don't know where or when they started their journey of Islam. Because in some way, shape, or form, we have been guided in a certain path. And we don't know where they started. And this lack of tolerancy would actually run people away from God, run people away from Allah. Imagine when they first entered into the community, into the MCHK Brothers group, but yet the thing that they come across most are basically arguments between Muslims. Imagine that new person to the community. How would he see Islam that preaches peace, that advocates peace? Right? But yet It's the practice is the very, or the lack of practice amongst us Muslim is actually the most difficult image to clear amongst the non-Muslim. So we should be very, very careful of running people away from Allah. Yeah,
Try to influence the other by your
yeah, exactly.
your deed, right?
Exactly.
It's very hard.
One more question?
Just adding on that one,
Yeah.
What has been said or written about persisting on an advice? Because when you mention about intolerance, one of the other reason is people get angry when someone advises and they don't listen, right? But then one of the main thing about giving advice is also to have patience. So what's been written or said about like persisting or like what are the best ways of actually doing it as well? Sometimes you have to stop giving advice and back off a bit, right?
I would say, what's the best way of giving? Wow, these are really tough questions. Like, there's no
There's no like perfect or
rule.
model answer.
Yeah,
to this,
exactly.
right? There's no.
By your experience.
It's not a math question. It's
Yeah.
It's humanity.
it's humanity, right? Everyone has different
Yes,
moral,
different
ethical
views,
standards.
different culture.
So like there was this time I encountered one of my friends like his parents didn't inform him that chicken had to be slaughtered properly as well. So he believed that beef needed to be slaughtered in accordance to the law. But then chicken was alright, you could just go on and eat chicken. So I tried to advise him against it, and then he was just like, oh, my parents told me this, right? So like, I just let the guy off at that moment.
Yeah, because at the same time, you don't want to ruin the relationship. You really want to take a more, I won't use the word lenient, but at the same time you want to take a more
Take it easy. There's an easy way. Don't get too hard.
wisdomic. There's such a word. It's not a word. You want to take a more wisdom approach when it comes to advising. Persistent advising, especially.
Advising is not controlling. So just up to them. Just say what you want, but not humiliate the person.
But at the same time, this is not to negate. Sometimes when we advise, when we give advice to a person, or persistent advice especially, those are advices usually really, really matter to you or to that person. Or at least we see it matter to that person whom we're advising. Right?
But to us, right? I mean, to me, if we see that it's important, then we voice out. Not every single word.
Yeah.
No, every single step I will tell you.
Yeah.
That's the main point. I want you to be good. That's why I will give you advice. And in Chinese, there's a word called 忠言逆耳. So when you hear someone nagging to you, nag at you, they don't accept, but they say the your mom. I'm sorry. So it's like the correct word. Actually, it's correct. I want you to be correct. Okay.
So what the brother is basically coming at the perspective is that usually good advice hurts.
Yes. Yeah, that's what I want to be.
Good advice usually hurts. And subhanAllah,
I'm trying to link with the Chinese
philosophy
with the Quran. Something is so similar.
Actually, Ibn Qayyim rahimahullah.
I don't know the character actually, but I see what it's like similar to our.
Yeah, and Ibn Qayyim rahimahullah actually mentioned something similar. So every single one of us have diseases that's affecting us. I mean diseases, not physical diseases, but diseases of the heart, basically. It could be some level of pride, it could be some level of hypocrisy, it could be some level of different internal disease that's affecting us. And he mentioned that the worse your disease is, the more bitter the medicine is. The more bitter the medicine is. Again, I'm coming at the position of accepting this advice. Because at the end of the day, we can't force anybody to accept an advice, but we can definitely learn how to accept them better. Right? So the more severe your disease is, the more bitter the medicine you need to be taking. Right? So this comes in the form of advice too, right? Which is exactly what the brother mentioned. But coming at your persistent, that's a very beautiful or relevant question, because sometimes an advice we've given is usually more than once. It's usually more than once. And I don't really have an answer for it, though, but it's definitely something worth thinking about. What's the best approach to it? Because at the same time, we want them to make or to be aware of the gravity of what we are advising them, but yet we want to take into better consideration the intricate relationship we have with that person. So I guess it's really a balance of both, where at the same time you don't want to harm the relationship, but yet you want them to accept that advice you're giving them.
If you give consistent, continuous advice, not one shot on the dot.
Or maybe what you can try though
Slowly.
is through different methods. Yeah, different approach. Because one approach, it could be the mistake on the approach you're taking, or it could be the advice you're giving. Right? So you want to try out different approach to help that person whom you're advising to better understand
And actually,
it better.
It's like, sorry, I talk too much. It's like, to compare it to the non-believer, the Muslim is more sincere to me. I mean, they're easily listen what you say. But if to the non-believer, they're very, I don't know how to say it, they're very
stubborn.
Yeah, sometimes stubborn, sometimes they're, actually I don't want what they're thinking of, so hard to catch.
But at the same time, subhanAllah, you bring out a very beautiful perspective. That sometimes when we give advice, sometimes we fail to notice is again the concept of empathy. Right, subhanAllah, sometimes when you give an advice, when somebody's doing wrong or when somebody is doing something that you dislike, sometimes we fail to see from their perspective. And if you manage to see through their perspective what they value, would actually be able to explain the cause or the result of that action. I'm not sure, is this getting too philosophical? I'll give you some practical examples. Say for example, if you see somebody who eats a lot of chicken, right? Eating a lot of chicken in itself is not really a problematic thing you need to advise somebody on. But I mean, eating too much chicken is a manifestation of his interest in chicken. That is the fundamental reason why he's having too much chicken. But sometimes when it comes to giving advice, we focus too much on the action itself instead of what causes the action. I'm not sure, am I making sense here? No, you guys are not. No, say for example.
Oily, is it? Too greasy?
No. I mean, what you want to do when it comes to advising is to know where they're coming from. That's exactly what Prophet Muhammad embodied, or what Prophet Muhammad would approach that person with. Say for example, the very famous narration where a young man who came into the masjid where companions were around, he asked Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, I want to commit an illegal act with a certain female. Right? Again, if the companion, or if this question were to be raised out, in Kowloon Masjid, that will be the last day you will be seeing him in the masjid. Right? He's gone. He's again gone. Like uncles will immediately enraged and make sure he's never stepping into the masjid, right? What did Rasulullah advise him of? Right? He advised that person through an approach, through a perspective that matters to him. What if somebody were to commit the same same illegal act with your family members? How would you see it? Right? And that's when the person would immediately recognize the harm of it. Because Rasulullah came from a perspective that matters to him. Right? Sometimes it's about knowing that person at the end of the day. When it comes to giving an advice that's both relevant and that's both accepting to that person, needs to at the end of the day depend on how much you know that person.
Just be positive. I mean, positive difference.
Yeah.
So it's like more. So a lot of the times we're tackling what or
Yeah,
how
exactly.
somebody is doing it, not
Yeah.
like why
they're doing it.
Yes.
So
Exactly.
we're always on the surface.
Yeah,
We're
exactly.
never-
Exactly.
We're never
Exactly.
down there.
It's that circle, right?
Exactly. Exactly. We focus on too much
Yeah.
on disapproving actions,
Yeah.
criticizing, advising actions, instead of finding the root cause of those actions. And sometimes if you know the why, subhanAllah, you will know what's the approach to go around it. What's a better approach to achieve the why that's leading them to achieve that,
Your
to
why
doing
may
that
be
action.
different from him, not from him. And from
Yeah, everyone has a
So,
different reason
No
of
point
doing what
argue,
they're
right?
Mm,
No one is perfect.
mm,
Only Allah knows, right? So just do up.
mm,
Just be positive. You can't change the game. The game is like this.
Some people may need to eat chicken to gain weight.
yeah, somebody might need chicken in their meal every day.
Yeah, to gain weight.
Yeah.
Because the more you complain, the more you be negative,
Mm,
the you feel very unhappy.
mm,
You affect the others.
exactly.
That's right.
Yeah. So at the end of the day, it depends. You want to cater, you want to advise through the lens of why and instead of what. And no matter how persistent your advice is, it will come in more understanding. Wallahi, you will come in more understanding to the person who is receiving that advice. Because somebody who can understand the rationale of your actions in itself already makes it more easy to accept that advice to come. Because at the end of the day, relationship resonates with one another. The more it resonates, the more connected you feel with that person.
The more advice people give you, the more benefit you will have.
Exactly.
Because people want it to be good, right?
So I'll end with a hadith where Rasulullah SAW mentioned, a believer to another believer is like a mirror. A believer to another believer is like a mirror. What does that mean? That means, of course, analogically, it means we are trying to beautify whatever is beautiful of each other and yet point out whatever is defective amongst each other. Right? So it comes with both giving advice and sometimes it's actually more difficult in accepting them. So may Allah make us amongst those who can accept sincere advice and give sincere advice, and make us amongst those who can live up or practice whatever good advice we've received in our life till the end of our time, till the end of our days. Ameen. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdik ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta nastaghfiruka wa atubu ilaik. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
The one, the one, the one, the one.